what were the most spiritual conversations you've had with people, or when they confess to you, or you confess to them and you say, I really am sorry. I didn't understand. I misread everything about our relationship. And the other person says, thank God you opened your eyes. Now I see you with new eyes. And Kerouac was trying to teach us how to see America through new eyes.
Welcome to the Subversive Orthodoxy podcast. I'm your host, Travis Mullen, and I'm excited to have you with us. This is a podcast about philosophy and meaning. It is about how we as humans withstand the challenges of our cultures. It is about the general Judeo-Christian revelation of God in the world and how the bloodiest century ever recorded couldn't kill that revelation. It's also about how that revelation, tossed aside as archaic, outdated, and obsolete, may be the very life-giving power we need to resist this distracted techno state we're living in, full of anxiety, depression, and teenage suicide.
It's great entertainment, thrilling entertainment. It's the inside story packed with drama.
Jack Kerouac lived two lives that never fully came together, and both shaped his work. He lived from 1922 to 1969. One life unfolded on the road. He traveled constantly, rode buses and freight cars, stayed up through the night in jazz clubs, and moved through friendships with manic intensity. This is the public image that followed him after the success of On the Road. The other life was quieter and more painful. Kerouac spent long stretches at home with his widowed mother, sitting at the kitchen table, drinking heavily, writing obsessively, and wrestling with guilt and prayer, memory and faith. These two lives existed side by side and formed the inner tension that runs through all of his writing. Kerouac was born Jean-Louis Labrie de Kerouac in Lowell, Mass., to French-Canadian Catholic parents. French was his first language, and Catholicism formed the emotional and spiritual atmosphere of his childhood. The death of his older brother, Gerard, marked him deeply. Kerouac believed Gerard became a kind of personal saint watching over him. This sense of unseen presence stayed with him throughout his life. His work returns repeatedly to the themes of innocence, loss, suffering, confession, and redemption. Even during his most reckless years, he carried rosaries, read devotional literature, and filled his journals with prayers. Although Kerouac became associated with rebellion and cultural rupture, he understood himself as a religious writer. He described his novels as confessions and saw writing as a moral and spiritual act. He believed attention was sacred and that to see people clearly and compassionately was a form of love. His spontaneous prose style grew out of his conviction. He wrote quickly and continuously in an attempt to capture experience before it hardened into abstraction. The rhythm of his sentences drew heavily from jazz, but his moral imagination came from his Catholic tradition. Kerouac's literary influences reflected his depth. He read the saints and mystics alongside Russian novelists. Dostoevsky held a central place in his imagination. Kerouac called him Dusty and returned to his novels repeatedly. He believed Dostoevsky revealed the moral drama of the human soul, especially the tension between freedom, guilt, and grace. From Dostoevsky, Kerouac learned that spiritual struggle belonged at the center of serious literature, and that a writer could expose his own weaknesses without disguise. Kerouac's cultural impact continues to shape American life. He helped define the Beat generation and influenced later countercultural movements. His influence can be seen most clearly in the generations that followed him. Bob Dylan credited Kerouac with shaping his sense of voice and freedom and poetic direction. Jim Morrison read Kerouac obsessively and modeled his understanding of the poet as public figure on him. Patti Smith described On the Road as a book that gave her permission to live as an artist. And Bruce Springsteen echoed Kerouac's vision of America as a landscape of yearning and motion. Beyond individual figures, Kerouac influenced memoir writing, songwriting, and the idea that a person's inner life could be laid bare without polish. His legacy lives wherever art treats restlessness and confession and spiritual hunger as legitimate subjects, rather than private failures. His vision of travel as pilgrimage and restlessness as a spiritual condition entered into the language of modern culture. Road trips, personal quests, memoir-driven fiction, and the idea of searching for meaning through movement all carry his imprint. Writers, musicians, and filmmakers continue to draw from his sense of immediacy and vulnerability. Kerouac never resolved the tension between his longing for holiness and his appetite for excess. His later years were marked by isolation, alcoholism, and grief. Yet he never abandoned his faith. Near the end of his life, he spoke openly of being Catholic and returned explicitly to prayer. His work endures because it captures a modern soul caught between freedom and belonging, desire and discipline, and wandering and home. Welcome, Larry.
Hello, Travis. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
We got a fun one today, Mr. Jack Kerouac.
Oh, yeah. I've tried to share my enthusiasm for Kerouac with all my Catholic and Buddhist friends, and it's a hard sell for some of them. I got to tell you, they have a hard time seeing through his reputation as a wild, hedonistic bad boy. So they don't really get that he was a serious artist, and maybe we'll change a few minds today. I'm hoping that we will.
Well, I think it's pretty evident once you unpack him that there's a lot more than what we know of him as a cultural surface level.
Yeah.
So yeah, the interesting thing for me was I was talking to one of my dad's friends, and he said, he used to be he was talking about his religious faith, and he said, "I'm a Jack Catholic." And I was like, oh yeah, well, I guess that's a term that people use. Like, I'm kind of like either a backslidden Catholic or I kind of go to church at Christmas or Easter. But I was in the shower after that, and it occurred to me about Jack Kerouac because I was studying for Jack Kerouac, and
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that brings a new meaning to Jack Catholic. It actually builds upon it.
I always thought Kerouac Catholicism should be a term that people would have to be Kerouac fans to understand how that connects with the faith in a serious way and is not just
Not just a subtext or something.
a cliche thing.
Well, Larry, why don't you tell us what, his main works are, his notable works?
Kerouac published a novel in the 50s, a very early realist work called The Town and the City. And it was kind of based on some of his early influences like Thomas Wolfe, and it was a lyric book, and it didn't really go anywhere, and it really wasn't it was about his family, and it didn't really take off. So it wasn't until On the Road was published that he had found his voice and that he entered into public life as a major literary figure. And part of that was because Allen Ginsberg had the year before published Howl, and Howl was banned, and so that made it a nationally famous poem. And in the dedication to the poem, he mentions Kerouac's 5 unpublished novels. And On the Road then was published the following year, and he became as famous, or even more famous than Ginsberg, and appeared on the Steve Allen show and read sections from On the Road. So that was the breakout book, On the Road. The Dharma Bums is the follow-up, is the sequel to On the Road, but it had already been written was being in the process of being written when On the Road was published. And that was about his relationship with Gary Snyder and his discovery of Buddhism. Oh, yes. Now, Big Sur was one of the last narrative novels that he wrote after he had already become famous, after he had become a Buddhist and then stopped being a Buddhist. So Kerouac considered himself a Buddhist for about 2.5 years, right in the middle of his fame. But then left that behind and went back to thinking of himself as a Catholic writer. But Big Sur was written about the period where he was trying to dry out from alcoholism, and he went to Lawrence Ferlinghetti's cabin up in Big Sur to try to sweat it out. And of course, what happened was the people found out he was there, and a bunch of fans showed up and groupies and threw big parties. And Kerouac couldn't resist, and he got drunk and he got sick. And when he woke up, he took a look at his life as a complete disaster. And the last part of that novel is where he comes face to face with his own stink, as James Baldwin puts it, and realizes that he is not going to make it unless he can somehow get this monkey off his back. And it's a very moving, powerful, spiritual side of Kerouac that you see in Big Sur. And then Desolation Angels is actually sort of written about earlier experiences where he served as a lookout on a mountain peak during the summer so he could live in solitude and write Desolation Angels, which is the book that came out of that. And that has a lot of spiritual reflections based on his Catholicism and his Buddhism as he tries to sort of sort out things in a sort of as a hermitage up there on the mountain in between Canada and the U.S. And then the other explicit spiritual writings, if you're looking for, the language where he's talking about God and Dostoevsky's influence and spiritual writers explicitly, you'll find that in the journals and in the letters more explicitly than you'll find it in the novels. And also, especially some of the Dharma, which is the book of that he collected of Buddhist wisdom, that he also wrote his own understanding of Buddhism for Allen Ginsberg, because Allen wanted to know more about Buddhism, and Kerouac is the one who turned Allen Ginsberg onto Buddhism. And the way he did it was through this book called Some of the Dharma, and that contains a lot of Kerouac's reflections on religious matters as well as on Buddhism. So those are the places you can go to get explicit spiritual statements, but the spirituality of Kerouac and his religious quest is made most explicit in On the Road, and then all the subsequent novels and publications of the previously written novels that were never published. Those have that has a lot of faith in it, or spiritual issues in it too, because he talks about the death of his older brother and his family life growing up in a Catholic family.
Are you talking about Visions of Gerard now, or is that?
Yeah, Visions of Gerard. Yeah, that's not listed as one of the most notable ones. But if you're interested in Kerouac's religious ideas and where they came from, and his relationship to the church, that's where you'll find them in some of those earlier novels before On the Road that were published after On the Road. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, cool. Yeah. I'm gonna go through some fun and interesting facts about him, because it's always fun to get kind of random overview at first. So that's taken. So here's the 10. We're actually adding an 11th, which was the professor's added one. So number 1, he wrote On the Road on a single continuous scroll. So he insisted on attaching papers together, and he ended up with a 120-foot roll. He taped together sheets of paper into 120 feet, so he wouldn't have to stop typing at a time. So he believed interruption killed honesty, and the scroll became like his symbol of like his writing style, of this uninterrupted flow. Number 2, he developed spontaneous prose as a spiritual discipline. So he believed that fast, unedited writing was a way to get around your ego, get to what was real. So he thought overthinking distorted reality, and that speed preserved sincerity. That is That is just so counterintuitive to me. I spent so much time like thinking and rethinking everything and never just trying to write spontaneous prose.
Yeah.
He was a serious football player before he was a writer. He had a football scholarship to Columbia University, but an injury ended it. That's a shocker. It never happened in football, which redirected his ambition towards writing. Number 4, he lived most of his life, or most of his adult life, with his mother. So, despite being imaged as a freewheeling drifter, Kerouac repeatedly returned home to care for his mother, and their bond shaped his guilt and his dependence and his inner conflict. It makes sense.
Yeah. Well, there's a song. There's a song by 10,000 Maniacs have a song, Kerouac. You heard that one?
No.
Yeah, we could have used it for bumper music today. And one of the opening stanzas has to do with his relationship with his mother, which I thought was very cool for the 10,000 Maniacs to give a homage to his mom.
He remained deeply Catholic even during his rebellious, lifestyle. He would pray, attended mass at times, and filled his journals with references to God, sin, salvation, and prayers. He never fully abandoned the faith that continued to haunt him. He was heavily influenced by Dostoevsky, which is so perfect for the timing. That's kind of why actually, he was here in the book in the order. So Dostoevsky and then Kerouac and then Walker Percy's next.
Mm-hmm.
So he was heavily influenced by Dostoevsky, whom he affectionately called Dusty, which is really a lot easier to say than Dostoevsky. He admired his ability to expose the soul under pressure. He saw him as a writer who understood suffering and grace and moral seriousness more than any other. By the time number 7, by the time Kerouac published On the Road, he had already composed over 1 million words in his journals and in unpublished novels that eventually were published. So that is an insane amount of words. For those of you who don't know, like an author thinks of a book in terms of words. So a small book would be 20 to 25,000 words. Most books are probably in the range of 40 to 60. Most popular books, and then big, textbooks are in the range of 100,000 or more. He was number 8. He was uncomfortable with fame and he felt betrayed by it. When On the Road made him famous, he felt exposed and constantly misunderstood. He believed readers celebrated the surface of his work and ignored its sorrow and depth.
Amen to that. Really,
I didn't know there was anything to Kerouac until I read your book. Number 9, alcohol gradually replaced the road as his escape. So as travel lost its power to satisfy him, drinking filled the void, and alcohol intensified his despair and accelerated his physical and spiritual collapse. Number 10, his later writing grows darker and more confessional, and I think more religious too. Books like Big Sur abandon romantic wandering and confront basically yourself, isolation, fear, and mental breakdown. And number 11, he died young, worn out by the life he could not reconcile. He died at 47, which is how old I am right now. From complications related to alcoholism, his life ended quietly, far from the freedom of his book seemed to promise.
Well, 47 is a turning point age. I think that's how old Elvis was when he died. Wasn't he 47?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think he was 47. And there's several of our famous rock star.
Well, I guess he was 42, actually.
Oh, 42. Okay, gee, 5 years younger.
Well, a lot of the rock stars died at 27.
Yeah.
I made it way past them.
We'll have to find out who the 47 one. There's another figure that was the same age as Kerouac. I remember running into that.
Yeah.
Well, those are interesting factoids that point to, the misunderstanding that's associated with his work, and his frustration with people not understanding that he was a serious writer and just looking for the party scenes or the wild descriptions of Neil Cassidy and other sub characters, and missing the whole thrust of what he's about.
The perception I would have had of him is like, oh yeah, he was just a beatnik hippie, told weird poetry. And I had no idea he wrote 1,000,000 words before he ever got published. That's a serious writer.
Yeah.
He's put in hours and has developed a style. And not just that, I mean, he was bringing a lot of depth into his writing too. So it's not what you think of a beatnik. You think of abstract poetry, really.
Well, on the Steve Allen show, when Kerouac had become famous for On the Road, and Steve Allen and he put out a record where Kerouac reads his poetry and Steve Allen plays jazz piano. And Steve Allen invited him on his show, and he said, "Oh, okay, before you read from On the Road, I'm going to ask you a couple of square questions. The first one is, what does beat mean? Because Beat Generation and beatniks were the big thing in the 50s. And Kerouac says beat means sympathetic. And Steve Allen didn't know what to do with that, because that's sympathetic. Most people think beat stands for beat up, or something like, you're down and out. That's a hunky's version of beat. And Kerouac thought beat was sympathetic. Later, he'd say it was beatific, that it was looking for the beauty in life and sympathy for your fellow man and sympathy for the sufferings of the world. That's what generates beat literature. And so it's interesting. Even Steve Allen, who made a record with him, didn't quite know what to do with Kerouac's self-characterization as somebody who's pursuing sympathy as the engine for his own writing. There's
That's deep. That's like not what he was expecting at all.
yeah, and then the Ethan Hawke famously said that he was inspired by Kerouac because Kerouac made it cool to be a thinking person on a spiritual journey. And that fits for a lot of those people you mentioned before, like Dylan, yeah, and the singers and Springsteen and Patti Smith and all. Those are all thinking people on a spiritual journey.
As we go into the journals, if you want to start preparing any one of those journals, they're all good in and of themselves for us to read. Buster had sent me some of these. I didn't have the book, but there's a book. Is it one book or a few books on his journals?
Is the one that the journals that he kept when he was writing On the Road and just before he wrote On the Road, and called Windswept World. It's published as Windswept World, and it's edited by David Brinkley, and he does a really good job at editing it. And those are all the journal entries that he wrote to himself when he was 25 years old, and 24 and 25 and 26, right in there, where he was coming to understand himself as an artist and reading Dostoevsky and Thomas Wolfe and being inspired by their kind of large canvas soul expressions, where literature becomes transformative, and a writer's job is to speak the truth and to have a sympathetic description of the world. It isn't a literature of hedonism, and it isn't a literature of him trying to get you to accept a spiritual view of the world. It's him, like Dostoevsky, throwing his faith up against the world and telling you what happens when you try to love it in the face of what really comes down in people's relationships and in the world that he sees in America at the time. And if you don't want to get on that train, then you might, get misinformed and think that this is party literature or something. I know that On the Road was once described as the first rock and roll novel. It came out at the same time as rock and roll, and beat spontaneous prose has a kind of a rhythm to it that's sort of hot jazz. But that's not how Kerouac saw himself. That was, he wanted his jazz to be soulful as well as multiple tempos and giving expression to the feeling life.
Mm-hmm.
So that
as we open up a few of his journal entries, okay, sure. Right before we do that, I want to read a few of my underlying parts from your book, from Subversive Orthodoxy, on Kerouac. So I'm just going to read through a few of them in a row and just string them together, because these are some of the parts that spoke to me about who he was and what it was saying about him.
Okay.
So Jack Kerouac once called himself a strange, solitary, crazy Catholic mystic. Ginsberg called him that American lonely prose trumpeter of drunken Buddha sacred heart, who embarked on a spiritual quest for the ultimate meaning of existence and suffering, the celebration of joy in the meantime. His life and his work were one long sustained experiment in the art of conjoining spiritual living to literary form. He believed that literature was a tale that's told for companionship, which is an interesting quote. Yeah, teach something religious, of religious reverence about real life in this world.
Yeah.
His style and worldview grew out of a neo-realist narrative aesthetic inspired by James Joyce. I saw that one. And then there's a part where you say, but I would go even further. So this quote you're commenting on says, in his quest to tell us everything that ever happened to him to bring him to this revelation, he moved from romantic lyricism to ecstatic joy of pure being, back down to the void pit of the great world snake, to the joyous pain of amorous love, and finally descended into a Catholic Buddhist serenity of penitential martyrdom. Through his writing, John Cleland Holmes remarked, an open circuit of feeling was established between his awareness and its object of the moment, and the result was as startling as being trapped in another man's eyes. And you said, but I would go even further and say the result is as startling as seeing through your own eyes for the first time. And Kerouac set out to do nothing less than to narrate soul perceptions to an increasingly soulless American middle class, hungry for revelations of life's everyday holy radiance. And there's a part here, you said something here where it sounds like America's first world problems currently with like suicide and depression. A part that says right here, human beings are not just organisms in environments or subjects within history, but individual souls working out their own salvation amid great worldly suffering and injustice. We all, as Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard well noted, possess transcendent longings that are inherently romantic, even often even antinomian, and make culture, language, and symbolic expression an inherent criticism of life, not just an illumination of reality. Literature, even at its in the best times, is never just the expression of universal truths or moral insight. It is also a tool for unlocking and disclosing the untapped spiritual possibilities inherent in one's time. So
Yeah. Well, that passage was in response to a conservative critic, Roger Kimball, who at the time had written some criticisms of the Beats, some really strong criticisms of the Beats, and especially Kerouac, for being nihilists and not appreciating the American dream and what it had done to lift people out of poverty, and that they were critics of America when America was fighting a Cold War with the Russians and could use all the support it needed. And of course, that criticism totally misses the point, because Kerouac's not saying that he didn't love America. In fact, he was probably one of the more pro-American writers of the late 50s and early 60s, and saw all his books as a celebration of the American cultural experience. But what he realized was, affluence doesn't necessarily imply spiritual welfare or happiness even, and that the spiritual struggle goes on under any environment, free or not free, and it's deeper than that. And so he addresses those problems, and so these
yeah, almost like he went ahead of the rock stars and found out ahead of time that, hey, chasing the dream actually ends up leaving you pretty depressed the next morning.
and like that new movie that's out now, Kelly with George Clooney.
Yeah, Jill and I started it last night. I saw your review.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful example of somebody who made it to the top and realizes that fame is more of a nightmare than it is a dream, and that he had exchanged his soul for all of these so-called smooth moves, and now he's having second thoughts. What does it really mean? Where was I why did I turn all my friends into acquaintances? And why did I pick my personal success over my friends and sacrifice the meaning of my life for the golden shekels? What did I do wrong? And that's why I think that's a very religious film, the J. Kelly, because it's a religious quest film of a guy who finally saw through himself and realized that he was pretty much living in his own bubble of self-congratulations of other people who really weren't all that impressed with them if you looked deeply into their real attitudes toward the guy that they worked for.
Yeah.
So, and Kerouac, he saw through himself very early, and he was a writer who believed in honesty, like James Joyce, tell the truth about your life. And so at one point in the 50s, and this is another reason why my Catholic and Buddhist friends sometimes don't share my enthusiasm for Kerouac. He said that, I don't have anything to offer anybody but my own confusion. And they took that literally, they took that as nihilism, and they took that as sort of, oh, this is a guy just playing around with languages and making myths out of his own experience. But that wasn't it. It was, all I have to offer you is the confession of the confusion we all share, and try to move through it in my own life and show you how hard it was for me, so that you might know how hard it is for you is not just your fault. It's the human condition. And these are some of the lessons I learned, on my way, and the people that I saw, and the advice I got, and the advice I didn't listen to that I should have, and the mistakes I made that I could have avoided. And all of this stuff is, in the novels, in those sections after the parties and after the road trip, where he's alone with himself and his soul, and he reflects with you, the reader, soul to soul. And that confusion doesn't mean that it doesn't have content, right? That it doesn't have spiritual value. I mean, what were the most spiritual conversations you've had with people, or when they confess to you, or you confess to them and you say, I really am sorry. I didn't understand. I misread everything about our relationship. And the other person says, thank God you opened your eyes. Now I see you with new eyes. And Kerouac was trying to teach us how to see America through new eyes, and not the new eyes of commerce and success and beating the Russians, but with the soulful eyes of the transcendental writers like Whitman and Thoreau and Emily Dickinson and Melville and all our greatest soul survivors. Mark Twain, those were his heroes. And James Joyce also, because Joyce was the Catholic who chose art over priesthood, but he wasn't an American. So Kerouac had to tell the American side of that story, which is a little different than an Irishman's story of his relationship to his faith. So that's why Kerouac, for me, is really a useful person who didn't censor himself, is not a creature of propaganda or ideology. This is serious literature.
Well, I think he had his own. I think what I'm picking up from the journal entries, from what I've read of On the Road, and from all the commentaries, that he saw there was something you just said about what he was kind of trying to do or whatever, and then there's another aspect where he was trying to just see the see you said transcendentals, yes. So you're trying to see the transcendent in everyday life too. So yeah, that unique angle where he's trying to not overlook normal living,
Right.
but trying to understand it through, I don't know, holy eyes, I guess. Like trying to understand life and its deeper meaning and not just flopping through it, like drifting.
Yeah. Yeah. There's one of the things Thomas Merton said. He was trying to explain sainthood, and he said a saint is not somebody who's famous for being holy. A saint is an unknown person who finds holiness in everybody else. And by that definition, Kerouac, is looking for the saintly behavior in everyone around him. And when he finds it, it becomes a chapter in his book. And it becomes, he could even see the positive side of Neil Cassidy that nobody else in the world could see, even at the time. But he had to admit at the end of On the Road, which for most people is probably the more explicitly spiritual part of the book. And in fact, it's the part of the book that when Kerouac was on Steve Allen, he combined one of the beginning chapters with the last chapter to give the reading more of a true trajectory for his novel. You start with all of this intense celebration of life, but then you end with a sober reflection on the ultimate lack of achievement at the end, that the journey has to go somewhere. It can't just continue on to another journey. And if you stop and ask, well, what did it mean? That takes you into deeper territory that maybe the next novel is going to address, and which it does. Dharma Bums is a much more reflective novel than On the Road, in the sense of looking for the meaning for what do all these travels mean.
Yeah. So one of these journal entries, I'll read one, and then you should read one.
Okay.
I'm gonna read the one that says the riddle of all riddles.
Okay, yeah, that'll be
I really liked this one. So there's a point where he's quoting Jesus before Pilate when he's about to get crucified, saying, "My kingdom is not of this world." He just has that in quotes. This is a journal entry, everyone.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
it says, "Hear its tremendous music, the music of thought, the dark music of dark thought. Of all riddles, this is the only riddle, the alpha and omega of riddles. I call it a riddle because it confounds the senses." So keep in mind, he's talking about my kingdom is not of this world.
Right.
"The riddle of life propounds in the souls of men a moral proposition to which they respond variously and at all times. All men are aware of the proposition, but most men ignore its meaning, a meaning almost invisible, and live vigorous, absent-minded lives, and trouble not themselves. Other men who know the meaning of the proposition of fairness and unfairness in the enigmatic situation of life seek consciously to trouble not themselves, and would imitate most men for strength. Finally, some men suffer from knowing all this and almost die in life until, and if they hold their sorrow well and seek strength to hold it more." Oh, that speaks to his sympathy life that he was going for. "There are 100 ways of saying this. The brothers Karamazov, and you can't go home again, say this. I wish I could say it with as much power and clarity. Moby Dick also says this, and Walt Whitman says it sometimes, some others." End of journal entry. That is not how my journals say. I wish I could say they did.
Yes. Yeah, that is, we should almost
writing.
we should almost read that again, because it was so rich. And
It's dense.
and if you're listening on podcast, you could rewind and go at slow-mo.
Yeah.
Because that's Kerouac in his journal. He's 24. Nobody reads his novels, or publishes them and this is the stuff he's writing to himself, to try to capture what he wants to write about and who he is and his relationship to his faith and to Dostoevsky's great novels. And it's, you don't, this is mysterious. I don't know how many people check out Kerouac's early journals from the library, but I don't think it's that many. I don't even know if they have them anymore. It's not easy to find.
Yeah, a lot of the subversive orthodoxy books I can't find in the library.
Yeah, and by
My local library didn't have a lot of them.
yeah, and by subversive orthodoxy books, you just mean any book that I mentioned in the whole book.
Yeah, like
Right.
the canon that you're mentioning.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to read two. Okay, can I read two?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is from his early journals. You can also find some of these quotes in Hard to Be a Saint in the City, The Spiritual Vision of the Beats, which is a book I edited that has the spiritual side of the Beat generation that has been maligned and misunderstood by misreadings and ideological critics who take things out of context and don't try to understand the source
Material.
the historical and personal sources out of which these ideas emerged. But here's one from his early journals about Dostoevsky. It's short, and then I have one on Christ that he wrote. These are both really nice quotes. The first thing that strikes me about Dostoevsky, beginning any of his books, is the nervous anguish that seems to have pierced the first page. The hero is always the same, comes to the first page out of eternities of introspection, anguish, gloom, just as I do every day. Okay, that's one. And then this is the quote on Christ. Christ, and for me, the modern gospel, has his religious fervor sees through the very facts and details of our everyday life, so that he doesn't have to concentrate his attention on flowers and birds like St. Francis, or on finances like Balzac, but on anything, the most ordinary things. There alone is proof about the sparrow that falls. It is the crowning glory of such a man as Spengler that he recognizes Dostoevsky to be a saint. The vision of Dostoevsky is the vision of Christ translated into modern times. The fact that he's barred in Soviet Russia implies the weakness of the state. Dostoevsky's vision is that which we all dream at night and sense in the day, and it is the truth, merely that we love one another whether we like it or not. We recognize the other's existence whether we admit it or not. And the Christ in us is the primum mobile of that recognition. Christ is at our shoulders and is our consciousness in God's university, as Cleo says. He is the recognizer in us. His idea is. The reason television admin get drunk at night is only because the nature of their pursuits shuts them off from meek love of fellow man, which is what we all want. D.H. Lawrence is a mere masturbation of the self in all his novels. I guess he had to add a little insult on D.H. Lawrence because he was probably a competing influence to Kerouac. But
This one on the
powerful stuff. I mean,
this is not what you think if you think Kerouac.
well, and if he had published it, Billy Graham would have ripped it apart. In the 50s, somebody would have taken this as heretic and used it as an excuse to flail about their own superior ideology, or in our culture right now, certainly that would be the case from right and left. So when you get words from the heart from anybody, it's worth paying attention, because you don't get words from the heart often, except very private moments with people who you've taken years to build trust with, to talk to you with this kind of soulful speech, and to make that your vocation, to say, I don't care if anybody publishes this, I'm going to write 1,000,000 words of soulful speech to the coming generation, so that when their hearts ache, they can go to a person that talks to them, and not a chatbot who gives them the generic world reduction of inner speech. Not that chatbot doesn't have its uses, but it's not this. It's not this kind of talk.
Yeah, it can't come up with this, that's for sure.
It's not. Well, there's no person behind it. There's no agency. There's nobody who's going to say, "I'm betting my life on these words."
That's what's so special about this podcast, is because this is talking about soul.
Yeah, yeah,
The AI cannot imitate that. I mean, it can imitate language about it, but it cannot, it does not have a soul, so it cannot come up with anything
yeah.
original.
Right, and it can't bet its life on it. It can only bet its capital on it, or its influence on it. These writers, were gambling with their human existence. Burdeniev, I mean, literally, those Russian social critics, my God, they were risking their lives with
Every word they wrote.
yeah, every word they wrote. And Kerouac, in a way, is too. His psychological life, his soul, his spiritual life, his health. I mean, he's trying to win back his life from his alcoholism. And when he was writing, there was no 12 step yet. I think 12 step was just beginning, and there weren't a lot of clinics dedicated to helping people, cure addictions. In fact, the Rat Pack appeared in Las Vegas with a mini bar on stage, and they would drink. Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra would drink highballs as they were singing, and that was considered American culture, American pop culture. Nowadays, they'd be banned. Or I don't know if they'd be banned. I guess they still do it in some ways in Vegas, but Kerouac was in some ways trying to break out of that. Big Sur shows the last gasp of that dream, or that novel. It's kind of his version of kind of The Great Gatsby, not being able to live the American dream of being, the big mucky muck, of having it all, and being the envy of everybody, sort of like Jay Kelly. Yeah, he becomes everybody's ideal, and yet when he's true with himself, he realizes he's nobody's ideal, and it's kind of time to come to Jesus, if we can put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So transitioning into On the Road. Okay. I personally been reading it. I'm not all the way through it yet, but you told me if I've read a good chunk of it, I've kind of gotten the vibe of what he's doing, how he's writing, and my observation was, like where's the spiritual Kerouac, and I had to dig around a little with you and online a bit to just kind of figure that out, and it turns out that the answer is that his spiritual faith coming through and On the Road is not that much in like talking about God directly, although he makes Professor and I talked about it, it's like he would have a big experience, like a whole chapter, and then you get like 2 lines at the end of the letdown after the chapter, how he just is not finding what he's looking for. And I'll share with you guys a couple that I underlined that were really cool. Once I saw them again, I underlined them because I'm like, oh, there it is. There's like what we're talking about. So one was in the chapter called, or no, he doesn't have names for the chapter. It's chapter 9. He's in Colorado in a town called Central City. And there was like a whole bunch of stuff that went on. They got in a big abandoned building and partied with a bunch of girls, and some young frat boys came in and took the girls away, and they went out to the bars. It was like a abandoned mining town. I was having a blast. So this is kind of just to give all you guys kind of the rhythm of the book. It's pretty fun. I think he's in a bar. Rollins gave him a shove to make room. He turned and snarled. Rollins handed me a glass and knocked him down on the brass rail with one punch. The man was momentarily out. There were screams. Tim and I scooted Rollins out. There was so much confusion the sheriff couldn't even thread his way through the crowd to find the victim. Nobody could identify Rollins. He went to the other bars. Major staggered up a dark street. What the hell's the matter? Any fights? Just call on me. Great laughter rang from all sides. Here's where he makes a little interesting comment after all that. I wondered what the spirit of the mountain was thinking. I looked up and saw jack pines in the moon and saw ghosts of old miners and wondered about it. In the whole eastern dark wall of the divide, this night there was silence and the whisper of the wind, except in the ravine where we roared. And on the other side of the divide was a great western slope, the big plateau that went to Steamboat Springs and dropped and led you to the western Colorado desert and the Utah desert. All in darkness now as we fumed and screamed in our mountain nook, mad drunken Americans in the mighty land. We were on the roof of America, and all we could do was yell. I guess, across the night, eastward over the plains, there was somewhere an old man with white hair was probably walking toward us with the word and would arrive any minute and make us silent. And the word is capitalized, so I don't know if he's referencing like a preacher or God himself walking up with her.
Well, that's what you read Kerouac for, to get to that section, to go.
They hit hard once you notice them.
Yeah, and you're in the bar, and your buddy punches out some guy, and he hides in the group and all that stuff, and then
you get this line. I wonder how the spirit of the mountain was thinking, and looked up and saw jack pines in the moon, and saw ghosts of old miners, and wondered about it. That line, I was just like, oh my gosh, there it is.
Yeah.
Very eerie, and very pensive.
Yeah, and
there's one other part I want to read.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's they're back to back. So that was chapter 9. Here's in chapter 10. There's some girl he liked, and he wanted to sleep with her. And then what happens after that is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I went to meet Ellen. I was reading it to my friends last weekend, and they go, that was a little rapey. So I was like, oh man, that's interesting. It's definitely a different time.
Yeah.
When I went to meet Rita Betancourt and took her back to the apartment, I got her in my bedroom after a long talk in the dark of the front room. She was a nice little girl, simple and true, and tremendously frightened of sex. I told her it was beautiful. I wanted to prove this to her. She let me prove it, but I was too impatient and proved nothing. So it's comedy. Yeah.
Yeah.
She sighed in the dark. What do you want out of life? I asked, and I used to ask that all the time of girls. I don't know, she said. Just wait on tables and try to get along. She yawned. I put my hand over her mouth and told her not to yawn. I tried to tell her how excited I was about life and the things we could do together, saying that and planning to leave Denver in 2 days. She turned away wearily. We lay on our backs, looking at the ceiling and wondering what God had wrought when he made life so sad.
Yeah.
We lay on our backs, looking at the ceiling and wondering what God had wrought when he made life so sad.
Yeah.
Just bam, after like a quick sex scene.
Well, and
his wife's so sad.
Well, you can see why Kerouac didn't survive the increased awareness of male sexual violence and insensitivity to that it was a pretty sexist world he's in, and the sexism is inexcusable. I think Kerouac should have known better than that. But you're right that he tries to at least ask the question, what are we doing here, and what is this all about, in the big picture? But some of there are in Dostoevsky there are parts like this too, where the protagonists reflect attitudes of their time that are not laudatory in any means. In fact, they're kind of self-convicting. But on another level, the fact that he owns up to it is kind of more honest than if he had pretended that he was a more sensitive lover than he really was. That's what makes the literature confessional in a way. That's why
It's amazing.
Yeah, and that's why we go back to Dostoevsky as well. It's those characters are confessional. It's somebody telling you their secrets, and it's not like lessons on how to live your life. It's more like lessons on how life was lived, and the sorrow and the thoughts and the feelings that come with those kinds of choices, as well as what he's learning about himself, so that when he gets back to San Francisco, and they want to go out to some wild party, he'll stay home and read or write or do something like that, having had enough on the road. So, yeah, that's a very interesting quote you read, and also raises those more critical questions that we have to admit.
Something that I really appreciated in kind of the analysis of what he was doing with On the Road was this line here or it's a quote of Kerouac. He says he said people accuse him of glorifying hedonism, and to that Kerouac responded, people think On the Road is about being a beat and kicks. It's really a story about two Catholic boys searching for God.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's our thesis, baby. That's our thesis.
And the theme was failure of the road to satisfy the soul, basically.
Exactly.
Yearning left over after the thrills. It's such a crazy lesson to hear from a beat, from the 60s.
Yeah.
It's like he cracked the code right as it's happening.
Yeah. Oh, that's right.
Detonated the bomb before it even went off, or no one caught on. That all this thrill life is it's not gonna pan out. And if all the rock stars that died at 27 could have grasped what Kerouac was trying to say. The theme for me that resonates really well is the idea of longing.
Yes.
Like, I felt that in my soul, like my whole life. Like that's kind of been the driving of keeping me in my faith, I think, through a lot of ups and downs and philosophical questions and church questions, but the longing for God and God's longing for us was always kind of like the such for me. And it's like it seems to really come through with Kerouac, like that like melancholy ache.
Yeah. Yeah. And then where he sees it in other people, when he picks it up from that girl. Uh-huh. And then he picks it up from his buddy who got in the bar fight, and the sheriff who's trying to make his way through the bar fight. And so when he says, well, what's beat about? Well, the meaning of beat is sympathetic. I want to sympathize with the humanity of all these people that I see on the road, and my friends, and the people that I meet, and that's what I'm recording. And so that gives you half of the story, because it's great that he has these longings, but then the other half is his struggle for some sort of ultimate beauty, ultimate salvation or redemption, and never quite achieving it. Always having this sort of monkey on his back with his addiction, and then also trying to put it into words and trying to talk about it. And that's why Buddhism was for him a fascinating thing, because it sort of talked about the same longing, the sort of like And with Buddhism, it's sort of like, well, make your peace with the longing, and then you're okay. And he understood that, but then it wasn't enough for him. He couldn't really make his peace with the longing as not having a lover back, something loving back in the universe in the same way that Christ loves back in the universe. And so that was always, so he comes back to his Catholicism, but he brings his bottle with him. And therein lies the tragedy of Jack Kerouac, and makes him, for me, just such a touching and powerful figure. Yeah. And a lot of the saints, were tragic figures. A lot of the saints were martyrs. So it isn't surprising that we would have one who just drank himself to death at the height of his own fame. Well, I think it was well put in that section you read on the teaching of Jesus that he wrote in his journal when he was 25. That the enigma of life, his kingdom, my kingdom is not of this world. Consider that just one more time. It's the most ringing sound of all human time. In a way, Kerouac's saying that too, right? I love this world. I find happiness in this world, even in the most unlikely places. In a bar fight in some obscure town in Centralville, Iowa, Montana, with my crazy friend Neil Cassidy, who's, just looking for sex. But that's not enough. That there's
I think he's very Kierkegaardian too in being real.
Yeah. And the paradox of it, when you think you've found it, you haven't found it. There's always more. It finds you when you're not looking. You didn't know it found you, that you've always been found. And when you find that out, there's such a grace in that moment, but then you forget. And these are the stories of living, and being young in America, all these false promises, all these promises, all this, how everything's going to turn out hunky-dory. And then you realize, the real victory is inner victory. My kingdom is not of this world. And Jesus taught me that. And Kerouac taught me that. And he's pointing his finger at that. And he's giving me the story of his search and how troubling and difficult it was. And he never really survived it. So that's what I think is interesting about him. And Dostoevsky's very similar. He was addicted to gambling pretty much his entire life. And it wasn't until, he wrote his masterpiece, and he really didn't get to write part 2 of the masterpiece because he died before he could do it. But the half-finished story is enough,
Yeah. Obviously, we're teaching the class for 25 years.
But right, it's enough. And Kerouac is kind of a half of the story kind of thing,
I think the sacrament, if there's a sacrament that Kerouac brings to the table, it's that of longing, and like being that value he had on the immediacy of his train of thought was his way of getting around the ego. So he thought that's how you be real. It's there, raw honesty. And I do see like that Kierkegaard about being real and knowing your true self it sounds like that's what that Kerouac was trying to do there, and finding his true self, allowing his true self to speak rather than doctoring it up with time, thinking about what he's trying to say.
Yeah.
And then that deep longing, that sad melancholy is also just being honest. So there's kind of like there's a little AA in him, even if he didn't have AA yet.
Yeah.
Raw honesty and confession.
Yes. Yes.
It's a value. That's an important asset to humanity.
Yes. And what's is it step one? I admit that I am powerless to solve my own problems and commit myself to the higher power. And then I have to go make amends with all the people in my life. That's Kerouac. And he was sort of groveling his way toward his own 12-step program. It would have been wonderful had he had found it. And instead of Some of the Dharma, we had Some of the 12-step book too, where, it's amazing that in order to get there, he had to go through Decline of the West and all of Balzac and Joyce, and to write over 1 million words to get him on the road to his own recovery, which he never could manage on his own. And because he was too famous and people loved him for the wrong reasons. They didn't love him sober. They loved him when he was Jack, lyric Jack, improvising poetry, in a cavern somewhere.
He also must have been so frustrated by that and the fame, being liked for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
Misunderstood in his writing that they weren't even giving him the real chance. And then obviously a life of frustration with the alcohol. That must have been rough. And you just said the word groveling.
Yeah.
So maybe a theme of him, if I put the two together, is a life of holy groveling.
Oh, that's a great praise. The Jay Kelly is a little like that too, where at one point he's talking to his agent, Adam Sandler, and Adam Sandler says, why are you so hard on yourself? You and I built this great career, and we've had all this success and everything. And the Clooney character says, that's not me. And I'm just beginning to find, who I am, kind of thing. And Kerouac must have felt that same disjunction, being celebrated for the act he was playing and not for the person that he was. And for, I'm sure that he probably thought that book that he wrote for his brother on Girard was one of his best books, because it was one of, his only sort of saint story, because he sort of conceived of his brother that died as kind of a saint figure. But of course,
like he turned into an angel.
Yeah. But of course, that wasn't the one people read. And some of the Dharma was never published until, 50 years maybe after he died, or not 50 years, probably 25 years after he died. And it just looks like a notebook of his sketches, which are really, his attempts to turn Buddhism into a literature. At one point he said, and this is also a great quote from Kerouac that I think is never recognized, is where he said that in the West, literature is the tantric yoga. The tantric yoga of the West is literature. And by that he meant, the tantric yoga is a technique for yoking with the absolute. It's a search for enlightenment, and for Kerouac, literature was the tantric yoga of the West. It was our language of connection that he was trying to use to make that to heal him. He was looking for redemption all the time, and sometimes he found it, and sometimes he didn't, and that's kind of the ups and downs of his novels. Looking at Kerouac, you don't have to love him for everything. Maybe he's the beginning, maybe he's the end. Maybe he's the longing that is no longer longed for, or maybe he's the beginning of a longing that has been lost along the way. The longing for soul, the longing for God, the longing for spiritual completion. And maybe when we get to Walker Percy, we'll see someone, a Kierkegaardian, who had a different take on how he might find what Kerouac is looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In that quote, he said, later artists will one day weave into a great unity. Yeah, like that's kind of what you did with your Subversive Orthodoxy book.
Well, amen, my brother.
Well, to end us, I'll read your last quote in the Kerouac section by Kerouac. It's a great ending. All I want to do is love, Kerouac wrote. God will come into me like a golden light and make areas of washing gold above my eyes and penetrate my sleep with his balm. But Jesus, his son, is in my heart constantly.
Thank you for listening to the Subversive Orthodoxy podcast. I hope today's conversation stirred something in you, whether you're a skeptic, a believer, or someone on a deconstruction journey. Come with us as we keep exploring what it means to seek meaning in a dehumanizing age, guided by prophetic voices who wrestled with faith and doubt, paradox and nihilism, because a prophetic imagination rarely speaks from the places we expect. It doesn't stay locked up in pulpits or seminaries. It breaks through in novels and poetry, charity, and art, through the strange and the quiet and the overlooked margins of culture. Thank you for listening. If you love our podcast or find it meaningful, here are some ways you can connect and share. Please subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, leave a 5-star review, and share with anyone who might resonate. Please follow us on Instagram at Subversive Orthodoxy. You can email us at subversiveorthodoxy@gmail.com. And now you can find podcast extras as well as all of my other creative work at my Substack, beingtravismullen.substack.com. Thank you. Spiritually, I want to jump off a cliff without a parachute like I'm high on cannabis and skip through fields naked like I wonder if I could drift or if I could drift through it. Dancing through moonlight under night. This has been the Subversive Orthodoxy podcast with Travis Mullen and Professor Inchausti. Oceanic scene. Say hi to human beings with a smile unseen. Grabbing wildflowers as I slide downhill.